Good afternoon. Thanks so much for being here, and I would also like to thank the conference organizers, Dr. Chaim Sperber, Dr. Boaz Cohen, Mr. Yaniv Zitrin, and of course, the indefatigable Rona Feast, who answered all of my emails so diligently about all of my questions about transportation. I also wanted to take time to thank the Adjasa Brandeis Institute for supporting this research and for making it possible for me to be here with you today. So, in 1890, the newly branded Jewish Publication Society of America published its first text, an extended edition of Anglo-Jewish woman writer Lady Katie Magnus's Outlines of Jewish History, which was first published in 1886. Just 1 year later, in 1891, the JPS took on the task of publishing the first English translation, which you heard quoted here, in his History of the Jews, which was first published in German in 1853, at least the first 4 volumes. It is no coincidence that the JPS published Magnus and Graetz's histories in reverse order. In fact, and aside from copyright negotiations, my talk considers how 2 Jewish women, Henrietta Szold, acting editor of the JPS, and Lady Katie Magnus, an educator and advocate for reform in liberal Judaism, shaped transatlantic discussions of Jewish historiography at precisely the moment when history became, quote, the master discourse of modern Jewish identity. With limited time, I'm going to draw on the methodology of Lady Katie Magnus and offer 3 brief snapshots as starting points for our discussion during Q&A. First, I want to briefly situate Henrietta Szold's work at the JPS and her well-known engagement with Graetz's work as part of an emerging transatlantic Semitic discourse about Jewish collective rather than national identity. Second, I will introduce you to Anglo-Jewish author Katie Magnus and her two important narrative histories, Outlines of Jewish History, and then her later Jewish portraits, and their critical engagement with Heinrich Graetz's History of the Jews, its methods, its aims, and legacy. And in my last portrait, I want to highlight for you some notable critiques and methodological questions Szold and Magnus pose about Graetz's magnum opus, which I argue and would be happy to explain further during Q&A, anticipated later observations and views of a history made by Gershom Scholem and Walter Benjamin some 50 years later. So the first snapshot. Henrietta Szold needs little introduction in these parts of the world, which I'm pretty happy about. However, I want to focus on the time that the co-founder of Hadassah, the Women's Zionist Organization, spent advocating on behalf of Jewry and its diversity through the written word, and her role as acting editor of the Jewish Publication Society from 1888 to 1916. It's no exaggeration to say that much of the best that has been, quote, thought and read or about the Jewish canon was made possible by Szold's often unremarked and unpaid labor as editor, translator, and fact checker and contributor at the JPS. And this is certainly true for the first 2 publications that put the JPS on the map, the Outlines of Jewish History and Graetz's History of the Jews. The first was collaboration between Henrietta Szold and Cyrus Adler, an established Orientalist and future president of the Jewish Theological Seminary. They collaborated with Magnus to update and expand her 1886 outlines to include the new section on the Americas. Jonathan Sarna's extensive study on the JPS notes that there was anxiety by the publication committee about whether an American press should publish a book by a British author as its inaugural text, but Magnus's text fit the bill of the new JPS mission, which was to bring multiple facets of global Jewry together without advocating on behalf of any one group interest, especially one over the other. This slowly changed at the turn of the century, but in 1888 until 1891, the goal of the press was to build an awareness of collective but not homogeneous Jewish identity. Szold was impressed by Magnus's narrative template and outlines, which included a cast of notable historical Jewish women. In her section to the Americas, Szold integrated notable American Jewish women like Rebecca Graetz and Emma Lazarus. As I mentioned, the JPS chose Magnus's 1886 outlines because it was so successful in England at bringing the Jewish history and the history of Judaism together without alienating a broad spectrum of Anglo-American Jewry. The original outlines broached the massive topic of Jewish history as a series of highlights and flashpoints that could be easily accessible for both adult and, quote, youthful readers, end quote, in order to increase general knowledge about the, quote, whole, sad, beautiful, and heroic story of the Jews. But more than a description of history as it actually happened, Magnus's history used Jewish and Christian sources, medieval Hebrew poetry, and contemporary British poets, among other materials, to contextualize and frame the events so as to build a running commentary about the contemporary cultural and religious significance of this history. At times bordering on homily, the original outlines made its biases and purposes clear. The history should inspire readers to a sympathetic understanding of the complexity of Jewish history, indicative of a, quote, advanced civilization, end quote. Within this context, this version of Jewish history was an important political counterpoint to the Wissenschaft research model on the continent, in particular to Heinrich Graetz's History of the Jews, published in '53. At the time, Graetz's history was already under contract to be published in English with a British press, David Nutt and the Strand. Bela Lowey and Israel Abrams were in the throes of translating the volume in consultation with Graetz. However, issues with the veracity of Graetz's text seemed to pose more challenges than originally anticipated. Written from a decidedly anti-reform point of view, Graetz's History of the Jews played fast and loose with several historical details in his attempt to fit them into his Hegelian-infused narrative of history of the Jews since biblical times. On the continent, Graetz's work had already caused quite a stir among Orthodox and Reform Jewish communities, and it was decidedly not the work that the JPS could underwrite as its inaugural publication. However, after the financial success brought on by the publication or republication of Magnus's outlines, the JPS secured the rights to Graetz's history. Szold took the lead on proofing and indexing what was believed to be the monumental publication of the first comprehensive English translation of History of the Jews. However, Szold's precision editing found not only translation mistakes, but also numerous incorrect citations and factual errors. And that's following on Jonathan Sarna's research. Additionally, Szold was an unpaid volunteer, and she, during this whole process, and compiled a 492-page index, which makes it searchable for a lot of reasons. I'm sure you found all those through other forms. But the idea that it could be searchable was, again, a tribute to her diligence and indefatigable kind of persistence to find and index and make it accessible. In the 1891 publication of History of the Jews, Szold and Adler actually inscribed this drama and conflict of their efforts into the front matter of the book notes, of the book's notes. And it's, in quote, "Owing to the necessary revision by the American editors, there has been a delay in the publication of this work beyond the time announced for its appearance. It is hoped that in the future such delay may be avoided." Signed, the publication committee. So it was very clear that there was something going on, and immediately following Graetz and Lowey's own prefatory remarks, big surprise, made no reference to the American editors or the revised or improved format of the book, except for Lowey briefly mentioning that there are, quote, various hands that brought it into English, but that she was responsible for the sole edited and revised text. In addition, Graetz made no mention of Szold or Adler's labor. I read this exchange as owing to a variety of factors, not in the least a turf war, but I also think it has to do with the purpose of the English translation as it was being imagined by the JPS and for American Anglo-Jewish audience. While Graetz and Magnus had distinctly different aims, both their histories emphasize the power of narrative historiography to shape the contemporary political context of global Jewry. In the preface to the English translation of Graetz's history, Graetz expresses his hope that English language readers will, quote, read, take to heart, and act in response to his history as they have done with other texts, end quote. Graetz wanted his history to be the lens by which Anglo-American Judaism could see a discrete, unified, and nationalized vision of Judaism. Magnus's outlines, I argue, was an important counterpoint here because it showed that while some practices and rituals had remained unchanged, following on Graetz's idea that Judaism had remained essentially the same, the historical evidence of how Judaism had changed was also there and kind of showed throughout history that it had changed based on communal consensus. I want to emphasize that Szold's work as the editor and contributor to both Outlines and History of the Jews exposed the fault lines of Jewish intercommunal debates about the role of Judaism within Jewish history already playing out as a Reform versus Orthodox Judaism in Anglo and German Jewish communities. Philip Bloch, Graetz's biographer, notes that Graetz's Orthodox leanings absolutely informed his historiographical ambitions. Unfortunately, even Graetz's version of Orthodox Judaism put him at odds with the Orthodox community in Berlin, specifically with his former mentor, Samson Raphael Hirsch, the spokesman of German Jewish bourgeois orthodoxy. As part of the JPS's new mandate, Szold and Adler had to adeptly navigate Magnus and Graetz's narrative histories to keep their readership broad by precisely relying on historiography to act as a common ground for disparate Jewish communities in England, Europe, and the United States. It is important to situate this strategy, in navigating between the two, within common practices of the late 19th century within common 19th century historiographical practices, because the JPS was part of a larger emerging network of Jewish institutions. Andreas Gottsman argues it is precisely during the moment of the early 1890s that history became, quote, the master discourse of modern Judaism and the medium of competing forms of Jewish collective identity in fin de siècle England and America. Similarly, Niles Romer argues in his essay, quote, Outside and Inside the Nations, Changing Borders in the Study of Jewish Past During the 19th Century, Romer analyzes a host of historical research institutes and societies in Europe and the United States, founded at the turn of the century, to support his claim that history was the new lingua franca of collective, national, and religious identity. And within these contexts, then, Szold and Magnus's work has new significance as part of a counter-Wissenschaft perspective, a model of history some Anglo-Jewish women argued reproduce anti-Semitic undertones towards religious Jewish communities and foreclose the possibility of a living model of Judaism for Reform and liberal Judaism Jewish communities. Snapshot number 2. English ladies contend with Heinrich Graetz. So Lady Katie Magnus was, above all things, an educator. She advocated for women's education, but was profoundly against women kind of attending Christian universities. There's a great series of letters between her and another Christian woman writer who is kind of critiquing Katie Magnus for not advocating for women to join, to go to university in England. And really what she's saying is that the center of the discourse or the epistemological centers of these universities are Christian-centric. And what that ends up doing is reproducing this kind of negative, a negative relationship to Judaism. She was really good friends with Amy Levy. Amy Levy provides a lot of the translations of Yehuda Halevi in her book, Jewish Portraits. And I think she was profoundly affected by Levy's suicide and and Levy was actually educated at Cambridge University. So it's a little bit of background. But in Outlines, right, Magnus's reform agenda, which is about expanding the role of women within Judaism, and then therefore in liberal Judaism, women actually are able to preach in the synagogue. Nina Davis Salomon or even Lily Montague end up playing large roles at the turn of the century in terms of liberal Judaism's model. But in Outline, she's clearly staking out a contested side of Jewish identity, and not just in opposition to Wissenschaft, but to Graetz's treatment of the parts of Jewish history that did not fit his model, specifically in his treatment of mystical or Karaite sects. For the example, in her 1886 publication of Outlines, she revises the history of the Karaites as heroes rather than heretics, a decision Szold chose to keep in the 1891 edition. For Magnus, Karaites were not harmful as much as they modeled that Judaism was capable of reforming its laws based on communal consensus. The Karaites were also important because they, like much to Graetz's chagrin, included women as equal participants in religious life. In Magnus's later historical narrative, the second edition of Jewish Portraits, published with David Nutt and the Strand in 1897, Magnus removes previous reference to Graetz, including a note about him as a, quote, sober historian, and readily challenges his methodology. Magnus specifically reframes figures like Yehuda Halevi, the Rothschilds, and even the heretical Sabbatai Zevi within a more flexible framework of Jewish collective identity that has room for multiple expressions of Jewishness, even those considered harmful, failed, or non-pure by Graetz's classifications. I would be happy to elaborate more on these examples, but I want to turn to these methodological differences and their impact on contemporary discussions of Jewish historiography in this next snapshot. So Magnus's Jewish Portraits is what I'm going to draw upon, and it was decidedly different in form and scope than Magnus's outlines. While following a chronological format, the historical sketches were crafted as responses to contemporary events, a sort of exegesis of Jewish history and scriptures that Magnus used to critique her contemporary political moment. Magnus uses biographical sketch form to revision Jewish communal identity through the lens of Jewish history's heroic movers and shakers, through past, quote, patriots, poets, philanthropists, and philosophers who, in hindsight, succeeded in bettering the Jewish community. In many ways, Jewish Portraits was a social experiment with the genre of Jewish history, especially its 1897 edition, which included more chapters readily pointed at discussions of Zionism. Magnus's sympathetic socio-historical approach to each Jewish portrait captures a fragment of the life and works of each writer in eloquent and thoughtful prose. In her summary analysis of Halevi, Magnus emphasizes the idea that history can only ever be a portrait that must be interpreted by every age. Magnus supports this by citing multiple historical interpretations of Halevi's poetry and prose. In doing so, she points out that history in general, quote, speaks neither loudly nor in chorus, end quote, and that's not necessarily a problem. Rather, Magnus views the incompleteness of every historical record to require the historian to identify the values systems at work, quote, man's ideals, end quote, as they appear in the literature of history. Magnus puts this model of history in contrast to those she classifies as the museum historians, who focus and perhaps commodify facts like the, quote, very pen with which Halevi wrote and the desk at which he sat, end quote. Magnus recounts the problems of unreliable transmission of such data from Christian crusaders to Catholic monks in order to show how history is, quote, twisted up with the conquerors, end quote. Walter Benjamin's analysis of historical documents makes this same point 50 years later. The dialectical image of a, quote, cultural treasure of civilization is also a document of barbarism, a narrative of conquest and violence. Magnus spends much of her own Jewish portraits pointing out the subjective nature of history, the, quote, layers of varnish, end quote, applied by centuries of different conquerors. In doing so, Magnus identifies the risk incurred by myopically hanging the value of the poets or historical persons on historical facts, which seems to leave the whole of Jewish national identity twisted up with the conquerors. Pushing beyond mere description and collection of data, Magnus insists that the task of the historian is never to ascertain the complete picture, but to work to understand the fragments revealed by the, quote, sidelights of a particular period. In doing some more, quote, honest history will contain multiple reflections of a single portrait and not to attempt to artificially produce a single authoritative narrative. In contrast, Graetz's conception of historiography, which in his essay, The Structure of Jewish History, 1846, he states the totality of Judaism is discernible only by its history. Its complete nature, the sum of its power, becomes clear only in the light of history. And so here I am playing with this idea of the light of history and the sidelights. And while Magnus's portraits does not escape problematic Victorian binaries of Enlightenment rhetoric of light and darkness. Her methodology seems to confound a telos of blind and inevitable progress by punctuating her histories with inquiries and contemporary comparisons. In this way, Magnus's history is dynamically but not ahistorically connected to her contemporary moment. This model also allows Magnus to, quote, brush history against the grain and repurpose Christian writers like Charles Kingsley to say something new about the role of medieval Hebrew poetry. In closing, I want to consider the question that these writers grappled with. Quote, what is Judaism? What is Jewishness or Semitism? These are questions that have and continue to reverberate in contemporary discussions in Jewish studies. It is only fair to acknowledge that this question is what started Jewish studies. Susanna Heschel's brilliant essay, Jewish Studies as Counterhistory, weighs in on behalf of Wissenschaft research models attempt to wrest Jewish identity from Christian-centric scientific models. In this essay, Heschel leverages David Biel's concept of counterhistory, a term he first used to identify what Gershon was doing to critique, as a systematic critique of Wissenschaft, to bring the historical origins of Jewish studies to bear on the then recent 1990s debate about the relationship of post-colonial studies and multiculturalism within Jewish studies in the academy. I reference Heschel here because she sees the debate between Graetz and Jaeger, or Orthodox versus Reform, as dialogical and part of the same emerging Semitic discourse that would make up Jewish studies. Building on this approach, I want to offer a counter-history of Graetz's later work as a way to foreground the historical role Jewish women played in offering a critical perspective of the still Christian-centric models adopted by Wissenschaft, historians like Graetz, and it seems only fitting to make this point at a conference considering the role of gender studies in contemporary discussion of Jewish and Israeli historiography. It's not a stretch, I want to emphasize, of the historical imagination to say that Graetz's work was indebted and influenced by his interactions with Jewish women writers across England, the continent, and the United States. In fact, Graetz imagines as much in an anonymous 15-letter exchange published in a German journal in 1883. The exchange takes place between him and an English, quote, English lady, pseudonymously named Edith, sometime before 1883. The gist of the exchange, and it goes on for 15 letters, is that Graetz, as he is in the throes of writing another volume of History of the Jews, either imagines or actually engages an Anglo-Jewish lady as his correspondent, to whom he attempts to parse out the effects of degeneration in the Jewish community, and his own antidote for a more orthodox view of Jewish history and Jewish life. One of the most notable aspects of the exchange is that Edith's, quote, feminine logic bests Graetz's, quote, masculine logic. It forces Graetz to revise his thesis. He even notes at one such moment, quote, one should not admit to a woman that she is right because she will detect therein the concession that she is never wrong, end quote. That was supposed to be a laugh, there you go. While I'm by no means suggesting that these women have it all figured out, I am arguing that Szold and Katie Magnus's work are two important examples of how Jewish women intervened in otherwise male-dominated arenas to articulate their own ideas about ethical historiography and its role in their contemporary society. Thanks.